I never thought a phone call could shatter 28 years of brotherhood in under 5 minutes. But there I was, standing in my Seattle apartment kitchen holding my cell phone like it might explode, listening to my older brother Danny demand half of our grandfather's inheritance because he had a family and I didn't. His voice carried that familiar, entitled tone I'd heard our whole lives, but this time felt different, crueler, more calculated. When I told him that Grandpa Earl specifically left me the money to establish a veterinary scholarship fund, Danny laughed bitterly and said I was being selfish, that family comes first, not some dead old man's pipe dreams. The aftermath of that phone call started immediately. Within 2 hours, my mother Patricia was calling me, her voice trembling with tears that sounded rehearsed. She launched into a speech about how Danny's family might lose their house, how his wife Jessica was crying every night, worried about their 2 young children's future. "Bernard, honey, you know your grandfather would want you to help family first," she said, sniffling into the phone. "Danny's been struggling so much lately and you're doing so well with your computer job. Surely you can spare some of that money for your brother's babies." I sat down hard on my couch, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Grandpa Earl left me specific instructions. He wanted me to set up a scholarship fund for veterinary students. He wrote it all out in his letters to me. We talked about it for months before he passed. "Oh, Bernard, you can't believe everything a sick old man says. Danny's been telling me how you might have influenced him when he wasn't thinking clearly." The accusation hit like ice water. Influenced him, Mom? I spent every weekend with Grandpa for the last 3 years, helping him with grocery shopping, doctor appointments, and yard work. Danny visited maybe 4 times total. "That's not true, sweetie. Danny says he was there all the time, but you probably just didn't see him. He's been so worried about his father-in-law's health, too." I realized then that Danny had been feeding her a completely different version of reality. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a group text from my sister Emma, who lived just 20 minutes from our parents in Columbus, Ohio. "Bernard, seriously, you're going to let your nephew and niece suffer because of some stubborn principle Danny just wants to provide for his family. Why are you being so heartless? Ma." My fingers shook as I typed back, "The money comes with conditions from Grandpa. It's not just cash I can hand out." Emma's response came instantly, "Stop making excuses. Family takes care of family. Period." Over the next 3 days, the pressure campaign intensified beyond anything I could have imagined. Family friends I hadn't spoken to in years started calling, each one delivering the same message with slight variations. Mrs. Henderson from church called Tuesday morning, her voice dripping with disappointment as she explained how Danny had confided in her about my sudden greed after Grandpa's passing. "Your grandfather raised you better than this, Bernard. Danny told me you've been hiding money from the family and refusing to help those precious children. I never would have expected such selfishness from Earl's boy." Neo. Wednesday brought a call from my father's golf buddy Carl, who informed me that Danny was such a devoted son that he'd been planning to use inheritance money to take care of our aging parents. "Your brother's got his priorities straight, son. Family first always. That's what real men do." Each conversation felt like a carefully orchestrated attack designed to make me question everything I knew about my own character and values. But the worst part was discovering how thoroughly Danny had rewritten history in these conversations. According to the family narrative he'd constructed, I was a selfish bachelor who had manipulated our dying grandfather, while Danny had been the devoted grandson who truly deserved recognition. Thursday evening, I received a call from our family pastor, Reverend Williams, whose voice carried deep concern, mixed with gentle rebuke. "Bernard, I've been praying about your situation with Danny, and I feel called to remind you of our Lord's teachings about generosity and putting others' needs before our own. Your brother came to me in tears, worried about providing for his family. Surely there's room in your heart for compromise." "Reverend, did Danny mention that Grandpa specifically wanted the money used for educational purposes? He left detailed written instructions about helping young people pursue veterinary medicine." "Well, son, Sometimes we have to balance the wishes of the departed with the needs of the living. Danny's children are real immediate needs. A scholarship fund is a noble idea, but charity begins at home. I hung up feeling completely isolated, like I was fighting an invisible enemy who had turned everyone I loved against me. That's when I decided to look through Grandpa Earl's papers more carefully, hoping to find something that might help my family understand his true intentions. In his bedroom closet, behind a stack of old fishing magazines, I discovered something that made my hands tremble. A small fireproof safe I'd never seen before, with a combination lock that used Grandpa's birthday. Inside, I found 3 thick folders containing documents, letters, and financial records that told a story I never could have imagined. The first folder contained correspondence between Grandpa and the estate attorney detailing his specific wishes for the inheritance and his concerns about family dynamics. The second folder held bank statements and financial records going back 5 years, but it was the third folder that made my blood run cold. Inside were photocopies of forged documents bearing Danny's signature attempting to gain access to Grandpa's accounts during his final months. There were also printouts of suspicious transactions, withdrawal attempts, and a letter from Grandpa's bank flagging unusual activity on his accounts. At the bottom of the folder in Grandpa's careful handwriting was a note that simply read, "Bernard, if you're reading this, then Danny's true nature has finally shown itself. Stay strong, grandson. The truth always wins." Friday morning, I called Sarah Chen, the estate attorney, and requested an emergency meeting. Her downtown office felt cold and sterile as she spread documents across her mahogany conference table, her expression growing more serious with each paper she reviewed. "Bernard, I'm glad you came in. We've had some concerning developments regarding your brother's interactions with our office." She pulled out a thick file labeled with Danny's name. "Over the past 2 weeks, Daniel has called our firm 6 times claiming to be co-executor of your grandfather's estate. He's demanded copies of financial documents and insisted he has legal rights to portions of the inheritance." My stomach dropped. Co-executor Grandpa named only me as executor. Danny knows that. That's correct, which is why we didn't provide any information. However, yesterday he appeared in our lobby with what he claimed were power of attorney documents giving him authority over estate matters. Sarah handed me photocopied papers that made my vision blur with anger. The documents bore Grandpa Earl's signature, but the handwriting looked wrong shaky in places where Grandpa's writing had always been steady. The dates didn't match up with medical records I knew about, and the witness signatures belonged to people I'd never heard of. "These are forgeries," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We suspected as much, which is why we contacted the bank immediately. What we discovered was quite alarming." Sarah pulled out bank statements that showed a pattern of attempted unauthorized access to Grandpa's accounts over the past 6 months. Someone has been calling the bank repeatedly claiming to be Earl's grandson handling his affairs. They provided enough personal information to convince junior staff members to give out account balances and recent transaction information. The evidence painted a picture of systematic manipulation that had been going on far longer than I realized. Danny hadn't just decided to claim inheritance money after Grandpa's death. He'd been planning this for months, possibly even while Grandpa was still healthy enough to notice what was happening. "There's more," Sarah continued, pulling out another folder. "Your brother hired a different attorney last week to contest your grandfather's will. The firm is Johnson Mitchell and Associates. They specialize in inheritance disputes and have a reputation for aggressive tactics." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. While I'd been grieving our grandfather's loss and trying to honor his wishes, Danny had been orchestrating a legal assault on everything Grandpa had planned. That afternoon, my mother called with what she clearly thought would be her final decisive argument. Her voice carried none of the gentle pleading from earlier conversations. Instead, she sounded resolved, almost businesslike. "Bernard, your father and I have made a decision. We're giving you until Sunday to transfer half of that inheritance money to Danny, or you can consider yourself no longer part of this family." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Mom, you can't be serious." "We are completely serious." Danny explained everything to us. He showed us bank records proving you've been hiding money from all of us. He told us how you manipulated your grandfather during his final months, taking advantage of his confusion to change his will. That's not true, Mom. I have documents that prove Danny has been lying about everything. Grandpa was completely lucid when he made these decisions. I can show you his letters, his detailed plans for the scholarship fund. Stop lying to protect yourself, Bernard. Danny brought us copies of medical records showing your grandfather had dementia. We know you took advantage of a sick old man, and we're ashamed of what you've become. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Mom systematically destroying every argument I tried to make. According to her version of events, Danny had been the devoted grandson, while I had been a manipulative opportunist. When I mentioned the forged documents, she accused me of creating fake evidence to frame my brother. Your sister agrees with us completely, she continued. Emma thinks you've become someone we don't recognize. The Bernard we raised would never put money ahead of his brother's children. What about what Grandpa wanted? Don't his wishes matter at all, or your grandfather was confused and sick, Bernard. Danny helped us understand that. We should be making decisions based on what's best for the living, not the confused ramblings of a dying old man. The casual dismissal of Grandpa Earl's intelligence and agency felt like watching his memory being murdered. This man who had built 2 successful businesses, served in Vietnam, and raised 5 children, was being reduced to a confused old man to justify stealing his carefully planned legacy. I need time to think about this, I said finally. No more time. Sunday deadline. Transfer the money to Danny or don't bother coming home ever again. We mean that, Bernard. Choose your family or choose your greed, but you can't have both. After she hung up, I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Everyone I loved had been turned against me based on lies, and I was starting to doubt my own memory of events. Had I somehow misunderstood Grandpa's intentions? Was I really being selfish by honoring his wishes instead of helping Danny's family? Then I remembered the safe in Grandpa's closet and his note about truth always winning. I made a decision that I knew would change everything. I booked a flight to Columbus for Saturday morning. If my family wanted to end our relationship based on lies, they were going to have to look me in the eye when they did it. That evening, as I packed my suitcase, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Transfer it to him or don't bother coming home. I took a screenshot of the message, added it to the growing file of evidence I was building, and continued packing. Whatever happened in Ohio, I was going to make sure the truth came out, even if it destroyed my family in the process. I landed in Columbus Saturday afternoon, under gray skies that matched my mood perfectly. The rental car felt unfamiliar as I drove through neighborhoods I'd known since childhood. Past the elementary school where Danny and I had played on the same baseball team, past the church where we'd been confirmed together, past all the landmarks of a shared history that suddenly felt like a lie. My parents' house looked exactly the same from the outside, but when I knocked on the front door, the coldness in my mother's eyes told me everything had changed forever. She barely looked at me as she opened the door, gesturing toward the living room where the rest of my family was already assembled. Danny sat in Dad's favorite recliner like he owned the place, his wife Jessica beside him on the couch, both of them wearing expressions of righteous indignation. Emma perched on the edge of the love seat, her arms crossed defensively, while our father Frank paced near the window like a caged animal ready to attack. Well, well, Danny said, his voice dripping with false surprise. Look who decided to show up after all. I figured you'd just transfer the money from Seattle and avoid facing the people you've been screwing over. I came here to have an honest conversation about Grandpa's wishes and what really happened during his final months. I replied, setting my overnight bag by the door and pulling out the folders I'd brought from the safe. Oh, please, Emma interrupted, rolling her eyes dramatically. Spare us another performance about poor old Grandpa's wishes. We all know what really happened. You saw an opportunity to take advantage of a confused old man, and you took it. I opened the first folder and pulled out Grandpa's handwritten letters detailing his scholarship plans. These letters span 8 months of correspondence with the estate attorney. Grandpa Earl was completely lucid when he made these decisions. He wanted to help young people pursue veterinary education because he never got the chance to go to college himself. Danny laughed bitterly. You could have written those letters yourself, Bernard. Sick old people are easy to manipulate, especially when they're isolated and dependent on one person for everything. Isolated Danny. When's the last time you actually visited Grandpa before the funeral, I mean? I was there all the time. He shot back, but his eyes flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. Just because you didn't see me doesn't mean I wasn't helping him. That's when I pulled out the second folder containing bank statements and visitor logs from Grandpa's assisted living facility during his final year. According to these records, I visited 87 times in the last 12 months. Emma visited 12 times. Mom and Dad visited 6 times. Danny, you're listed as visiting exactly twice. The room went silent except for the sound of Frank's pacing footsteps on the hardwood floor. Those records are probably fake too, Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. Bernard's in computers. He could make anything look official. That's when I pulled out the third folder, the one containing evidence of Danny's attempted fraud. What about these documents, Manny? Can you explain why you tried to forge power of attorney papers to access Grandpa's bank accounts? Danny's face went pale, then flushed red with anger. You're making that up. I never forged anything. I spread the photocopied documents across the coffee table, along with the bank's investigation report and the security footage timestamps showing Danny at the bank during Grandpa's final weeks. The bank has video of you trying to withdraw money from Grandpa's accounts using forged identification and fake power of attorney documents. Frank stopped pacing and moved closer to the table, his expression shifting from anger to confusion as he examined the papers. Danny, what is this stuff? It's lies, Dad. Bernard's trying to frame me because he knows he's been caught stealing from the family. But I wasn't finished. From the bottom of the folder, I pulled out Grandpa Earl's journal from his final year, the one I'd found hidden behind his photo albums. This is Grandpa's daily journal. He documented every visit, every conversation, and every concern he had about family dynamics. I opened to a page dated 3 months before Grandpa's death and read aloud. Danny came by today asking about my bank accounts again. He seems to think I'm too old to manage my own money. Tried to get me to sign some papers about letting him help with finances. Something doesn't feel right about his sudden interest in my affairs, especially since he's never cared much about visiting before. The silence in the room became deafening. Emma's face had gone ashen, and Jessica was staring at her husband with obvious shock. I continued reading, found out today that Danny's been telling people at church that I have dementia and can't make good decisions anymore. Patricia called me crying, worried about my mental state. Had to assure her that I'm fine and explain that Danny might be spreading these stories for his own reasons. That's enough, Danny said, standing up abruptly. I don't care what lies you've put in some fake journal. The bottom line is simple. I have a family to take care of and you're single with no responsibilities. Grandpa would want his money used to help real people with real needs. Grandpa documented your real needs too, I said, flipping to another page. Listen to this. Discovered today that Danny has been stealing from Emma's children's college fund. Sarah mentioned that $7,000 disappeared from the account she set up for the kids. Danny had access as their uncle and emergency contact. Emma doesn't know yet, but I'm going to have to tell her. Emma gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. That's not true. Danny would never steal from his niece and nephew. Emma, I said gently, when's the last time you checked that college fund balance? The look of dawning horror on her face told me everything. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, logging into her banking app. The color drained from her face completely as she stared at the screen. The account says it has $900 left, she whispered. There should be almost $8,000. Danny exploded into defensive anger. Those records are wrong. Banks make mistakes all the time, Emma. You can't believe this garbage Bernard's putting together to frame me. But the evidence was overwhelming, and even our parents could see the pattern emerging. Frank picked up another document from the pile, this one showing Danny's gambling activity, at the local casino during the months he was supposed to be helping with Grandpa's care. Danny, Frank said slowly, these casino receipts show you lost $14,000 at poker tables over the past 6 months. Where did that money come from? I don't have to answer these accusations, Danny shouted. This whole thing is a setup. Bernard's been planning this for months, gathering fake evidence to make me look bad so he can keep all of Grandpa's money for himself. That's when Jessica spoke for the first time since I'd arrived, her voice quiet but deadly serious. Danny, I found credit card statements last week showing cash advances totaling $12,000. When I asked about them, you said they were for emergency car repairs, but we haven't had any car problems. The walls were closing in, and Danny knew it. His response was to attack everyone around him with increasingly desperate accusations. You're all ganging up on me, Jessica. You know I'd never lie to you. Emma, you know I love your kids like my own mom, Dad. I'm your son. How can you believe these lies over your own flesh and blood? But the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Patricia sat down heavily on the couch, her face in her hands as she began to realize how thoroughly she'd been manipulated. Danny, just tell us the truth. Did you take money from Emma's children? I borrowed it temporarily. I was going to pay it back when Grandpa's inheritance came through. It's not stealing if you're planning to return it. The admission hit the room like an explosion. Emma started crying. Frank's face turned red with rage, and even Jessica moved away from Danny on the couch. So you did take it, Emma said through her tears. You stole money from your own niece and nephew's education fund to feed your gambling addiction. It's not an addiction, Danny screamed. It's an investment strategy. I've been trying to build money for our family's future. If Bernard wasn't being so selfish with Grandpa's inheritance, I wouldn't have needed to borrow anything. I stood up slowly, gathering the documents spread across the table. Danny, I'm not going to give you money to continue gambling away. But I want you to know that Grandpa's trust includes provisions for family members who genuinely need help, including addiction treatment. I don't need treatment. I need my family to stop believing lies about me. That's when my father's phone rang. Frank answered it impatiently, his expression growing darker as he listened to the voice on the other end. When he hung up, he looked at Danny with something approaching disgust. That was Carl Henderson from the bank. Apparently, you've been using my name and social security number to apply for loans. They want to know if I authorized you to use my identity for credit applications. The final piece of Danny's deception had crumbled. Even he seemed to realize that his web of lies had finally collapsed beyond repair. His response was to threaten physical violence, advancing on me with clenched fists until Frank stepped between us. That's enough, Danny. Get out of this house right now and don't come back until you're ready to tell the truth about what you've done. As Danny stormed toward the door, Jessica gathered her purse and followed him, pausing only to look back at our family with tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I should have known something was wrong months ago. After they left, the four of us sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of Danny's deception and our own willingness to believe his lies about me. But the worst was yet to come. That night, as I tried to sleep in my childhood bedroom, my phone rang 47 times. When I finally answered the 48th call, Danny's voice was slurred with alcohol and trembling with rage. You think you've won, you piece of garbage? I'm going to destroy you for this. I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows what kind of manipulative snake you really are. By the time I'm finished with you, you'll be lucky if anyone ever speaks to you again. The voicemail he left after I hung up was even worse, filled with threats that made me genuinely fear for my safety. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I called Sarah Chen's emergency number and told her to immediately freeze all inheritance assets and begin legal proceedings to protect the estate from any further fraud attempts. By midnight, every dollar of Grandpa Earl's inheritance was locked down tighter than Fort Knox, and Danny's fraudulent activities were being investigated by both the police and the bank's security department. There was no going back now. Sunday morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Sarah Chen's voice carried excitement mixed with professional satisfaction as she delivered news I never could have expected. Bernard, you need to get down to my office immediately. Yesterday's investigation into your brother's activities uncovered something remarkable about your grandfather's estate planning. It turns out he was far more prepared for this situation than any of us realized. I drove to her downtown office through empty Sunday morning streets, my mind racing with possibilities. What could Grandpa Earl have planned that even his attorney didn't know about? Sarah greeted me with a thick folder and a cup of coffee, her expression a mixture of amazement and respect. Your grandfather was an extraordinary man, Bernard. What I'm about to show you proves that he understood your family dynamics better than anyone gave him credit for. She spread documents across the conference table, each one more surprising than the last. 3 months before his death, your grandfather established a secondary trust through a different law firm. He specifically instructed them not to reveal its existence until certain conditions were met. What conditions? Attempted fraud by a family member against the primary inheritance. Sarah pulled out a letter in Grandpa's handwriting, addressed specifically to me. He predicted that someone in your family would try to contest his will and attempt to steal from the estate. This secondary trust was his insurance policy. I opened the letter with trembling hands and read Grandpa Earl's familiar, careful script. Bernard, if you're reading this, it means someone in our family has shown their true colors by trying to take what isn't theirs. I've been watching your brother's behavior for months, and I suspect he's got problems bigger than any of us realized. The trust I'm leaving you isn't just about money. It's about giving you the tools to help him properly when he's ready to be honest about needing help. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Grandpa's observations about Danny's increasing desperation, his gambling problems, and his manipulative behavior toward family members. But more importantly, it outlined a comprehensive plan for addressing these issues through structured support rather than enabling. The secondary trust contains properties I never told anyone about. Sarah explained, pulling out real estate deeds and property assessments. Your grandfather owned 4 rental properties in different parts of the city, plus a small apartment complex near Ohio State University. The total value is approximately $2.3 million. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. $2.3 million. On top of the original inheritance. That's correct. And here's the most remarkable part: your grandfather structured this trust specifically to address family addiction and mental health issues. There are detailed provisions for rehabilitation services, family counseling, debt consolidation assistance, and even educational support for grandchildren. But everything requires complete honesty and professional oversight. Grandpa had thought of everything. The trust included requirements for financial transparency, mandatory counseling participation, and graduated levels of support based on demonstrated progress toward recovery. It wasn't about punishment, it was about creating structure that would force genuine healing. There's more, Sarah continued. Your grandfather also established relationships with 3 private investigators who've been monitoring your family's financial activities for the past year. They have documented evidence of your brother's gambling losses, fraudulent loan applications, and theft from various family members. The scope of Danny's deception was even larger than I'd realized. According to the investigators' reports, he'd been stealing small amounts from family members for over 2 years, always careful to take sums that wouldn't be immediately noticed. The college fund theft was just the tip of the iceberg. Monday morning, I called the police department to file formal fraud reports, armed with overwhelming evidence that made the case ironclad. Detective Maria Rodriguez reviewed the documentation with obvious amazement at the thoroughness of Grandpa's preparation. Your grandfather was quite a planner, she said, organizing the evidence into neat piles. This level of documentation makes our job very straightforward. We'll need to arrest your brother for check fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. Given the amount of money involved and the premeditated nature of these crimes, he's looking at serious jail time if convicted. But my goal wasn't to destroy Danny. It was to force him into the kind of help he desperately needed. That afternoon, I met with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in gambling addiction and family therapy, whom Grandpa had specifically recommended in his letters. Your grandfather contacted me about 8 months ago, Dr. Walsh explained during our consultation. He was concerned about your brother's behavior and wanted to understand how to help someone with a gambling addiction who wouldn't admit they had a problem. She pulled out notes from her conversations with Grandpa detailing a treatment plan designed to address not just Danny's gambling, but the underlying emotional issues that drove his need to lie and manipulate family members. Earl was very clear about his goals, she continued. He wanted to create consequences severe enough to break through your brother's denial, but with sufficient support to help him rebuild his life properly. The trust structure he designed is actually quite brilliant from a therapeutic perspective. That evening, as news of the investigation spread through our extended family, I received calls from relatives who had also been victimized by Danny's schemes. Cousin Margaret had lent him $3,000 for what he claimed was Jessica's emergency medical bills. Uncle Robert had co-signed a loan that Danny defaulted on 6 months later. Aunt Linda had hired Danny for painting work he never completed, despite being paid in advance. The pattern was always the same. Danny would identify a family member's emotional vulnerabilities, create an urgent need story, and extract money through guilt and manipulation. He'd been running these schemes for years, always careful to keep individual amounts small enough to avoid triggering serious investigation. Tuesday brought the most shocking revelation yet. Jessica called me in tears, explaining that she'd been going through financial records and discovered that Danny had taken out a second mortgage on their house without her knowledge, using forged documents that contained her signature. "Bernard, I don't even know who I married," she sobbed over the phone. "He's been lying to me about everything. The mortgage payments, we've been struggling with the credit card debt, even the reason he lost his last job. None of it was true." She revealed that Danny had been fired from his construction job not for company downsizing, as he'd told everyone, but for stealing tools and materials to sell for gambling money. His foreman had given him multiple chances to come clean, but Danny continued lying until video evidence made his termination unavoidable. "Jessica, there's help available through Grandpa's trust," I told her. "You and the children can get counseling, financial planning assistance, and even temporary housing if you need to separate from Danny while he gets treatment. I want to believe he can change Bernard, but I'm scared. He's become someone I don't recognize. Yesterday he screamed at our 6-year-old daughter for asking why Daddy was so angry all the time. That's when I knew we couldn't keep living like this." Wednesday evening, I received a call from Reverend Williams, the pastor, who had initially pressured me to give Danny the inheritance money. His tone was completely different, now filled with embarrassment and concern. "Bernard, I owe you a profound apology. Danny came to our church board meeting last night asking for emergency financial assistance, and when we asked for documentation of his family's needs, the truth began to unravel. We discovered he's been taking money from our benevolence fund for months, claiming various family emergencies that apparently never existed." The Reverend explained that Danny had been systematically manipulating church members, creating different crisis stories for different people to maximize the emotional manipulation. One family thought they were helping with medical bills, another believed they were preventing foreclosure, and a third had been told Jessica was pregnant with complications requiring expensive treatments. "I'm ashamed that I pressured you about your grandfather's inheritance without investigating the situation more thoroughly. Your brother is clearly struggling with issues that go far beyond financial need." By Thursday, the investigation had expanded to include the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, as Danny's fraudulent activities crossed state lines through online banking and credit applications. The scope of his deception was staggering: 14 different fake identities, 23 fraudulent loan applications, and estimated total theft exceeding $90,000 from various victims over 3 years. But Friday brought the call that truly broke my heart. Emma called me sobbing, having just discovered that Danny had been systematically stealing from our mother's prescription medication, selling her pain pills and anxiety medication to fund his gambling. Patricia had been suffering in silence for months, believing her medications weren't working properly, never suspecting that her own son was stealing from her medicine cabinet. "Mom's been in pain this whole time because Danny was taking her arthritis medication," Emma cried. "She thought she was developing a tolerance, or that the doctors weren't prescribing enough. She never imagined that her own son would steal from her when she trusted him with her house key. That evening, I sat in my hotel room reviewing the mountain of evidence that had accumulated in just 1 week. Danny's addiction had corrupted every relationship in his life, turning him into a predator who targeted the people who loved him most. But Grandpa Earl had seen it coming and prepared a path toward healing that balanced accountability with genuine support. The trust fund provisions included complete rehabilitation treatment, family therapy for Jessica and the children, financial counseling, and a structured plan for Danny to make restitution to his victims over time. But it all required one thing that Danny had never been willing to provide: complete honesty about the scope of his problems and genuine commitment to change. Friday night, my phone rang one more time. It was Danny calling from the county jail where he'd been arrested on multiple fraud charges. His voice was different now, stripped of the anger and manipulation that had characterized our recent conversations. "Bernard," he said quietly, "I need help." Monday morning's newspaper changed everything for our entire community. The front page of the Columbus Dispatch featured a story titled, "Local Man Arrested in Multifamily Fraud Scheme," complete with Danny's arrest photo and details about his systematic theft from relatives, church members, and local businesses. But the story that really destroyed him came Tuesday when the school district newspaper ran an expose about missing PTA fundraising money. According to the investigation, Danny had been serving as treasurer for his children's elementary school parent organization while embezzling nearly $8,000 over 18 months. I read the article with growing horror, realizing that Danny's gambling addiction had driven him to steal from the very community that was supposed to trust him with their children's educational needs. The money was supposed to fund new playground equipment, library books, and educational field trips. Instead, it had been fed into slot machines and poker tables, while parents wondered why promised improvements never materialized. The community reaction was swift and devastating. Parents who had volunteered countless hours for fundraising events learned that their efforts had been financing Danny's addiction rather than helping their children. The betrayal cut especially deep because many of these families had also been manipulated by Danny's stories about struggling financially to support his own family. Wednesday brought another revelation that shattered what remained of Danny's reputation. The local Catholic church where he'd been volunteering as a youth group coordinator discovered that he'd been stealing from their summer camp fund. Father Martinez called me personally to apologize for initially supporting Danny when the inheritance dispute first became public. "Bernard, I want you to know how deeply ashamed I am for believing your brother's lies about your character. Daniel came to me claiming you had abandoned your family obligations, and I accepted his word without investigation. Now we've learned he's been stealing money intended to provide camping experiences for underprivileged children." The priest's voice carried genuine pain as he explained how Danny had manipulated the church community's compassion to cover his crimes. "He told us heartbreaking stories about struggling families who needed help, and we gave him money believing he would distribute it appropriately. Instead, he kept it for his gambling activities." But the story that finally reached the broader community came Thursday when WBNS 10 TV ran an investigative piece about gambling addiction and its impact on local families. They interviewed Jessica on camera, her face partially obscured to protect their children's privacy, as she described the systematic deception that had destroyed her marriage and financial security. "I thought I was married to someone struggling with employment issues," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never imagined that my husband was stealing from his own family, including money set aside for our children's education and medical emergencies. The man I married would never have done these things, but addiction changed him into someone I didn't recognize." The news piece included interviews with addiction specialists who explained how gambling disorders often escalate into fraud and theft as people become increasingly desperate to fund their activities or repay debts. Dr. Walsh appeared in the segment discussing the importance of family intervention and structured treatment programs. Friday morning brought a surprise that restored some of my faith in human nature. Pastor Williams called to inform me that the church congregation had voted unanimously to establish a scholarship fund in Grandpa Earl's memory, specifically designated for young people pursuing veterinary education. Your grandfather was a pillar of our community for over 40 years, he explained. When our congregation learned about his vision for helping young veterinarians, they wanted to honor his memory properly. We've raised $12,000 already, and several members have committed to ongoing monthly contributions. The irony was beautiful. Danny's attempts to destroy Grandpa's scholarship plans had actually generated more community support than we ever could have achieved on our own. Word about the fund had spread through local social media, attracting donations from people who wanted to support educational opportunities while also honoring a man who had been victimized by his own grandson. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visit at my hotel from Emma, who looked exhausted but determined. She carried a stack of papers and a bottle of wine, settling into the chair across from my bed like she planned to stay for hours. "I need to tell you everything," she said without preamble. "About how Danny manipulated me, how I let jealousy cloud my judgment, and why I was so quick to believe lies about your character." She explained that Danny had been working on her for months, gradually convincing her that our grandfather favored me unfairly and that I was taking advantage of his affection to secure financial benefits. "He told me, you were visiting Grandpa so often because you were pressuring him to change his will. He said you were isolating him from the rest of the family to maintain control over his decisions." Emma's voice grew quieter as she admitted her own role in the family's dysfunction. "I was jealous of your relationship with Grandpa Bernard. You two had always been close in ways that the rest of us never achieved. Instead of appreciating what you were doing for him, I let Danny convince me that you had ulterior motives." She pulled out copies of text messages between her and Danny showing months of carefully crafted manipulation designed to turn her against me. In retrospect, the psychological manipulation was obvious, but Emma explained how gradually Danny had introduced doubts about my character, always mixing lies with enough truth to make them believable. "He told me you were planning to use Grandpa's money to move away from Ohio, permanently abandoning the family for a more successful life in California or New York. He said you looked down on those of us who stayed close to home, and that you saw Grandpa's inheritance as your ticket to a better class of people." The sophistication of Danny's emotional manipulation was staggering. He had identified each family member's specific insecurities and crafted customized lies designed to exploit their fears while positioning himself as the victim of my alleged selfishness. "Emma, I never wanted to leave Ohio permanently," I told her. "I love Seattle, but this will always be home." Grandpa understood that, which is why he structured the trust to help local students pursue veterinary education. Saturday brought news that Danny had been transferred to a residential treatment facility rather than remaining in county jail. His attorney had negotiated a plea agreement that included mandatory addiction treatment, restitution payments to his victims, and 5 years of supervised probation. If he completed the treatment program successfully and maintained sobriety for 12 months, some of the charges would be reduced. Jessica visited me Saturday evening to discuss the trust fund provisions for families affected by addiction. Her relief was visible as Dr. Walsh explained the comprehensive support services available through Grandpa's carefully designed program. The trust includes funding for family counseling, children's therapy, temporary housing assistance, and financial planning education, Dr. Walsh explained. "Your grandfather understood that addiction affects entire families, not just the person with the disorder." Jessica broke down crying as she realized the scope of support available for rebuilding her life. "I've been so scared about how to provide for my children while Danny gets treatment. I didn't know how we'd survive financially, and I was terrified about the emotional damage this has caused them." The trust provisions included specific support for children affected by parental addiction, including individual therapy, educational assistance, and structured activities designed to rebuild stability and security. Grandpa had thought of everything, creating a safety net that could help heal the damage Danny's addiction had caused throughout the family. Sunday brought the most meaningful call of the week. Danny himself called from the treatment center, his voice carrying none of the anger or manipulation that had characterized our recent conversations. "Bernard, I need to say something to you, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." His voice was shaky but determined. I've been lying to myself and everyone else for so long that I'd started believing my own stories. The counselors here are helping me understand how my addiction turned me into someone who could steal from family members and justify it as being owed something. He paused, and I could hear him breathing carefully, like he was following a script he'd practiced many times. "You never owed me anything. Grandpa Earl left you that inheritance because he trusted you to use it wisely, and because you earned that trust through years of caring for him when the rest of us couldn't be bothered." The admission hit harder than any of his previous anger or manipulation. For the first time in years, I was hearing my actual brother speak instead of the person his addiction had created. "I stole from Emma's kids, from Mom's medicine cabinet, from the church, from everyone who trusted me. I told myself I was borrowing money to help my family, but really I was feeding an addiction that made me care more about gambling than about the people I claimed to love." His voice broke completely as he continued. "My children have been living with a father who was angry, desperate, and dishonest every single day. Jessica has been married to someone who lied about everything from job loss to debt to medical emergencies. I turned our home into a place of stress and fear because I couldn't admit I needed help." The conversation lasted almost an hour, with Danny taking responsibility for specific incidents of theft, manipulation, and emotional abuse. But more importantly, he began outlining concrete steps he was taking to address his addiction and make amends to the people he'd harmed. "The treatment program here lasts 6 months, but I'm planning to stay longer if necessary. I want to rebuild relationships with my children based on honesty and reliability. I want Jessica to be able to trust me again, and I want to find a way to pay back everyone I stole from, even if it takes years." When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope that my brother might eventually return from the person his addiction had turned him into. 3 months later, I found myself standing in Grandpa Earl's bedroom, cleaning out the last of his personal belongings before selling the house to fund additional scholarship opportunities. Hidden behind his dresser, I discovered one final envelope marked "For Bernard, open only after truth emerges." Inside was a letter that explained everything I'd been wondering about since the crisis began. Grandpa's careful handwriting revealed the depth of his planning and the profound love that had motivated his seemingly harsh treatment of Danny's situation. "My dear grandson," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means the crisis I predicted has played out, and your brother's addiction has finally been exposed to the family. I know this has been painful for everyone, but sometimes pain is the only thing that can break through the walls people build around their problems." Grandpa went on to explain that he'd been documenting Danny's increasingly erratic behavior for over 2 years, watching helplessly as gambling addiction turned his oldest grandson into someone who would lie to and steal from family members. But rather than simply cutting Danny off or exposing him publicly, Grandpa had designed an intervention strategy that would force accountability while providing comprehensive support for recovery. I could have confronted Daniel directly about his stealing and gambling, but addicted people are skilled at explaining away evidence and manipulating family members into enabling their behavior. Instead, I created a situation where his true character would reveal itself naturally, while ensuring you had the tools necessary to help him properly when he was ready to change. The letter continued for 6 pages, detailing Grandpa's research into addiction treatment, his consultations with Dr. Walsh, and his careful selection of trust fund provisions designed to address not just Danny's gambling, but the underlying emotional issues that drove his need to manipulate and control others. "The secondary trust isn't punishment, Bernard. It's a treatment plan disguised as an inheritance structure. Every provision requires honesty, accountability, and genuine commitment to change. I could have just given Daniel money, but that would have enabled his addiction. Instead, I've given him the opportunity to earn back his family's trust through demonstrated change." Reading Grandpa's explanation, I finally understood the elegant psychology of his approach. By creating a crisis that forced Danny's lies into the open, he'd eliminated the family's ability to enable the addiction through denial or misplaced sympathy. But by structuring comprehensive support through the trust fund, he'd also ensured that genuine recovery efforts would be rewarded with substantial assistance. That afternoon, I visited Danny at the residential treatment center for our first face-to-face conversation since his arrest. The change in his appearance was striking. He'd gained healthy weight. His skin looked clearer, and most importantly, his eyes held the kind of clarity I hadn't seen in years. "I've been reading Grandpa's letters to the family," he said as we sat in the center's visiting room. Dr. Walsh showed me copies of his correspondence with her about addiction treatment. I finally understand what he was trying to do. Danny explained that the treatment program had helped him trace the development of his gambling addiction, back to feelings of inadequacy and resentment that had been building since childhood. "I was always jealous of your relationship with Grandpa. Your success in college, your career in technology. Instead of dealing with those feelings honestly, I tried to medicate them with gambling excitement. The honesty was refreshing after years of manipulation and lies. Danny was learning to take responsibility not just for his criminal behavior, but for the emotional patterns that had led to addiction in the first place. The counselors here helped me understand that I wasn't just gambling for money or excitement. I was gambling because winning made me feel like I was finally successful at something, like I was proving I was worth as much as you or Emma or anyone else who seemed to have their lives figured out." He paused, gathering courage to continue. "When the gambling started losing money instead of making it, I couldn't admit failure because that would mean facing all the inadequacy feelings I'd been trying to avoid. So I started stealing small amounts to keep gambling, telling myself I'd pay everything back when I won big." The treatment center had helped Danny understand how gambling addiction typically escalates from recreational activity to compulsive behavior to criminal activity, as people become increasingly desperate to fund their habits or recover losses. His pattern was textbook increasing bet sizes, lying about losses, borrowing money under false pretenses, and eventually stealing from trusted sources. "I stole from Emma's kids because they couldn't fight back or hold me accountable. I stole from the church because religious people were easy to manipulate with sob stories. I stole from Mom's medicine cabinet because she trusted me with her house key and wouldn't suspect her own son." The admission was painful to hear, but also encouraging, because it demonstrated genuine understanding of how addiction had corrupted his moral reasoning. Danny was learning to recognize the thought patterns that led to justifying harmful behavior as necessary or temporary. 6 weeks later, I attended Danny and Jessica's first joint counseling session, facilitated by Dr. Walsh with support from the Trust Fund's family therapy provisions. Jessica's progress was as remarkable as Danny's, though her healing focused on rebuilding self-trust and setting healthy boundaries rather than overcoming addiction. "I've spent 3 years making excuses for Danny's behavior because I loved him and wanted to believe his explanations," Jessica told the group. "I enabled his addiction by accepting his lies about job loss, medical emergencies, and financial stress without demanding proof or accountability." The family therapy sessions were revealing patterns of dysfunction that went beyond Danny's gambling addiction. Our entire family had developed habits of avoiding difficult conversations, accepting surface explanations for concerning behavior, and prioritizing harmony over honesty in ways that enabled rather than addressed problems. "Emma and I both knew something was wrong with Danny's stories about visiting Grandpa," Jessica admitted. "But instead of investigating or asking direct questions, we chose to believe his version of events because confrontation felt too uncomfortable." Dr. Walsh explained that families affected by addiction often develop communication patterns that accidentally support continued addictive behavior. When family members avoid asking direct questions or accept obvious lies to maintain peace, they inadvertently signal that honesty isn't actually required for maintaining relationships. The therapy sessions were teaching all of us to communicate more directly, set clearer expectations for accountability, and distinguish between supporting recovery efforts versus enabling continued destructive behavior. 8 months after the crisis began, our family gathered for Emma's birthday celebration, our first holiday gathering since Danny's arrest. The atmosphere was different from our traditional family events, more honest, less performative, and focused on genuine connection rather than maintaining comfortable illusions. Danny had been granted a day pass from the residential center specifically to attend, and his children's reaction to seeing him was both heartbreaking and hopeful. 6-year-old Sarah ran to hug him immediately, while 9-year-old Michael approached more cautiously, still processing the changes in their family structure. "Daddy, are you feeling better now?" Sarah asked her innocent question, cutting straight to the heart of what everyone wanted to know. "I'm learning how to be better," Danny replied carefully. "I made some very bad choices that hurt people I love, and now I'm working with doctors to make sure I don't make those choices again." The honesty was age-appropriate, but direct reflecting skills Danny had learned in therapy about maintaining truthful communication without overwhelming children with adult complexities. Michael nodded seriously, apparently satisfied with his father's explanation. Later that evening, as family members shared updates about work health and future plans, Danny asked for permission to make an announcement that surprised everyone. "I wanted you all to know that I've been accepted into a vocational training program for addiction counselors," he said. "It's a 2-year certification program that I can complete while continuing my own recovery treatment." The room went silent as everyone processed this unexpected news. Danny continued, his voice gaining confidence as he explained his new direction. "I want to use my experience with addiction and recovery to help other people who are struggling with gambling problems. I've learned so much about how addiction develops and how it affects families, and I think I could help people avoid the mistakes I made." Emma was the first to respond, her voice filled with genuine pride. "Danny, that sounds like meaningful work that could help a lot of people. I'm proud of you for finding a way to turn your experience into something positive." The evening continued with cautious optimism as family members shared their own growth experiences from the past year. Patricia had started attending Al-Anon meetings to address her own patterns of enabling addictive behavior. Frank had begun individual therapy to work on anger management and communication skills. Emma was taking financial planning classes to better protect her children's educational funds. "This crisis forced all of us to examine our own behavior patterns," Mom admitted. "I realized that I'd been avoiding difficult conversations with Danny for years because I was afraid of conflict. That avoidance actually made it easier for his addiction to continue unchecked." As the evening wound down, I found myself reflecting on Grandpa Earl's wisdom in designing an intervention that addressed family systems, rather than just individual behavior. His trust fund provisions had created accountability, not just for Danny, but for all of us to develop healthier communication and relationship patterns. 1 year later, I stood in the Columbus Convention Center watching Danny receive his 1-year sobriety chip at a Gamblers Anonymous meeting attended by over 200 people. His transformation was remarkable. Confident posture, clear speech, and genuine warmth in his interactions with fellow recovering addicts who looked to him for guidance and inspiration. His acceptance speech that evening brought tears to my eyes as he shared the story of his addiction, criminal behavior, and recovery with unflinching honesty. "I spent 3 years stealing from everyone who trusted me, including my own children's college fund and my grandfather's medical payments. I justified every theft by telling myself I was a victim of circumstances beyond my control." Danny continued, his voice growing stronger as he described the intervention process that had saved his life. "My family's refusal to enable my addiction felt like abandonment at the time, but it was actually the most loving thing they could have done. Sometimes people who care about you have to let you face consequences in order to motivate real change." The audience was completely engaged as Danny explained how Grandpa Earl's trust fund structure had provided comprehensive support for recovery while requiring absolute accountability for past behavior. Recovery isn't just about stopping destructive habits. It's about rebuilding your character and earning back the trust you've damaged through your actions. 6 months into his sobriety, Danny had begun making restitution payments to his victims through a structured plan overseen by the court and funded partly through the trust provisions for addiction recovery. Emma's children had their college fund restored. The church and school organizations had been repaid in full. Even the smaller amounts stolen from various family members had been returned with interest. But more importantly, Danny's relationship with his children was healing in ways that money couldn't measure. Jessica had decided to rebuild their marriage, but only after Danny completed 18 months of treatment and demonstrated consistent behavioral change. They were attending couples counseling twice weekly and had established clear boundaries about financial transparency and accountability. "Sarah and Michael are learning to trust me again," Danny told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. "But they're also learning that love doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior from people. Jessica's teaching them that it's okay to set boundaries with family members who aren't acting in ways that feel safe." The children's therapy had been remarkably successful, helping them process the trauma of living in a household dominated by addiction, while developing emotional tools for maintaining healthy relationships in the future. Both kids were excelling academically and socially, their natural personalities emerging as family stress decreased. Jessica's own healing journey had been equally impressive. The trust fund's provisions for families affected by addiction had enabled her to complete a degree in social work, focusing on family therapy and addiction counseling. She was planning to work alongside Danny in helping other families navigate recovery processes. "I want to help wives and children who are dealing with addicted family members," she explained during a family gathering. "I understand the confusion, fear, and enabling patterns that develop when you love someone whose behavior has become unpredictable and harmful." Emma's growth had been more subtle but equally significant. She'd completed financial planning certification and was now helping other single mothers protect their resources while building educational savings for their children. Her relationship with me had deepened beyond our childhood dynamics into genuine adult friendship. "I spent too many years competing with you instead of appreciating the different strengths we each brought to our family," she admitted during one of our sister-brother conversations. "Danny's crisis taught me that family relationships work better when people support each other's success rather than keeping score about who has received more attention or opportunities." Our parents had perhaps changed the most dramatically of anyone in the family. Frank had completed anger management counseling and was learning to express concern and disappointment without explosive emotional reactions. Patricia had developed skills for having direct conversations about difficult topics, rather than avoiding conflict through denial or wishful thinking. We enabled Danny's addiction by being afraid to ask hard questions or demand proof when his stories didn't make sense. Mom acknowledged during family therapy. "We chose comfort over truth, which accidentally taught him that lying was acceptable as long as it avoided confrontation." Their marriage had strengthened significantly as they learned to work together in addressing family problems rather than hoping individual family members would somehow resolve issues on their own. The scholarship fund established in Grandpa Earl's memory had grown beyond anything we'd originally imagined. Community support, combined with careful investment of the trust fund assets, had created an endowment capable of providing full veterinary school scholarships to 3 students each year. The first recipients were now completing their second year of studies at Ohio State University. But the scholarship that meant the most to our family was awarded to Maria Santos, a young woman from Danny's recovery center who had lost her veterinary career due to prescription drug addiction. The fund paid for her rehabilitation, continuing education, and eventually her return to practice under supervised conditions. Grandpa Earl's vision was about second chances for people who had made mistakes but were committed to rebuilding their lives properly. I explained to Maria during the scholarship award ceremony. "You represent exactly what he hoped this fund would accomplish." Maria's success story became a powerful example for other people in recovery, demonstrating that addiction didn't have to permanently destroy career dreams or family relationships. Her work with animals in distress paralleled her own journey from addiction to recovery, creating meaningful connections that aided both healing processes. 18 months after Danny's arrest, I received news that changed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the veterinarian who had helped establish the scholarship selection criteria, asked me to dinner to discuss expanding the fund's scope to include addiction recovery research. Our professional collaboration had developed into personal attraction over months of working together on fund administration. Sarah understood family addiction dynamics from both professional and personal experience, having grown up with an alcoholic father who had eventually achieved long-term sobriety. I admire how your family handled Danny's crisis. She told me during what was obviously a date disguised as a business meeting. Most families either completely cut off addicted members or enable their behavior indefinitely. You found a way to provide accountability and support simultaneously. 6 months later, I proposed to Sarah at the pond where Grandpa Earl had taught me to fish as a child. The location felt perfect because it represented the continuity of love and wisdom that had guided our family through its darkest period toward genuine healing and growth. Earl would have loved Sarah, Mom said during our engagement celebration. She has the same combination of compassion and practical wisdom that made him such a good judge of character. Our wedding took place 2 years after Danny's arrest in the same church where he'd stolen money from the benevolence fund. But instead of being a source of shame, the location represented redemption and community forgiveness. Danny served as my best man, having earned back the trust and respect that qualified him for that honor. Pastor Williams officiated the ceremony, incorporating themes of forgiveness, accountability, and second chances that reflected our family's journey from crisis to healing. Love sometimes requires us to allow people we care about to face consequences for their actions, trusting that truth and accountability create better foundations for relationships than comfort and avoidance. The reception featured speeches from family members who had learned important lessons about enabling versus supporting, honest communication versus conflict avoidance, and the difference between helping people versus protecting them from the natural consequences of their choices. 3 years after the inheritance crisis began, Danny graduated from his addiction counselor training program and accepted a position at the same residential treatment center where he'd received help. His first client was a young father whose gambling addiction had led to embezzling from his employer's payroll account. "I understand exactly how you justified those choices," Danny told him during their initial session. "I also know that recovery is possible if you're willing to be completely honest about the scope of your problem and committed to making amends for the harm you've caused." Danny's work was exceptionally effective because his personal experience with addiction, criminal behavior, and recovery gave him credibility with clients who might otherwise resist treatment recommendations. He understood the psychological patterns that lead people to rationalize harmful behavior, and he could recognize manipulation techniques because he'd used them himself. As our family gathered for Christmas dinner 3 years later, I reflected on the profound wisdom embedded in Grandpa Earl's inheritance planning. His seemingly harsh approach to Danny's crisis had actually been the most loving intervention possible, forcing accountability while providing comprehensive support for genuine change. Grandpa knew that giving Danny money directly would have enabled his addiction. I said during my holiday toast to the family. Instead, he gave us the tools to help Danny save his own life, while protecting the rest of the family from continued manipulation and harm. The toast continued as I acknowledged each family member's growth and contributions to our collective healing. Emma's financial planning skills were helping other families protect their resources. Patricia's Al-Anon experience was assisting other parents dealing with addicted children. Frank's anger management success was inspiring other men to seek help with emotional regulation. But the most important lesson Grandpa taught us is that love sometimes means allowing people to face the full consequences of their choices, trusting that truth and accountability create better foundations for relationships than enabling and avoidance. 6 months later, Sarah and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Hope Earl Mitchell, honoring both Grandpa's memory and our family's journey from crisis to healing. Danny and Jessica's children were excited to have a new cousin, and their joy reflected the emotional security that had returned to our family through honest communication and mutual accountability. As I held my newborn daughter, I thought about the lessons I would teach her about family relationships, personal responsibility, and the difference between supporting people versus enabling harmful behavior. Grandpa Earl's wisdom would guide another generation toward healthy choices and genuine love. The Veterinary Scholarship Fund continued to grow, now supporting 12 students annually and funding addiction recovery research that was helping families across the country navigate similar crises with better outcomes. Grandpa's vision had created ripple effects far beyond our immediate family, touching lives in ways he never could have anticipated. Have you ever had to choose between enabling a family member's destructive behavior or forcing them to face consequences that might save their life? Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to make it easier for people to continue harming themselves and others. Real love requires the courage to tell the truth and maintain boundaries even when it feels harsh or uncomfortable in the moment. I hope this story encourages you to think about the difference between helping and enabling in your own relationships. If you found value in this message, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel for more stories about family recovery and redemption, and sharing this with someone who might benefit from hearing about second chances and the power of accountability combined with genuine support. Thank you for allowing me to share our family's journey with you. May you find the courage to love people enough to tell them the truth and the wisdom to know when compassion requires consequences rather than comfort. Sometimes the greatest inheritance we can leave our loved ones isn't money, but the opportunity to become the people they were meant to be through facing their challenges with honesty, support, and hope.